Well, hello YouTube, it's me Fortmaster, and welcome to a new reaction, and this is The Cage, an analysis of Kris, Control, and the Soul by Serial Introvert. As it was probably, revealed in Chapter 3 and 4, and I think we can all be on the same page here, it's pretty much been established here that somebody's messing with the prophecy, or at least how it's supposed to be playing out. Because, one, it's rather obvious that, Susie was not supposed to be the girl in the prophecy. And on top of that, there is, what I'm going to assume the main portion of this video is going to be about. It seems like the prophecy, while we were supposed to be part of the prophecy, it was supposed to be in the Goner vessel we designed at the beginning of the game, not in Kris. Now, the question still stands, why? Because as Rousey said, even when it's thrown off or destroyed, the prophecy still does come back. So, is the knight, who I assume is Des, or whoever's working with them, like, manipulating how things are playing out so they stay close enough to the prophecy that it won't rebound, while simultaneously trying to use the prophecy for their own goals, whatever those might be? Honestly, just, the whole thing is confusing, and just, I have a couple of ideas, but I need to, take a day or two and try to, straighten them out just to figure out potentially what they could be. But yeah, again, as I said, two things blatantly obvious. Susie wasn't supposed to be in the prophecy, and Kris wasn't supposed to be in the prophecy. So somebody is playing around with variables here. But yeah, I guess we should probably get this thing started then. So yeah, of course, as always, original video is linked in the description. If you haven't seen it for some reason, corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day. And if you like this video or any other video that I make, I'd very much appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to my channel, because almost 3/4 of the people that watch my content aren't subscribed, and I'd very much like that to change, because my goal for this year is to hopefully hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year, or at least, try to get close to that. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
With the release of Deltarune chapters 3 and 4, a lot of people have been comparing the quality of Undertale versus Deltarune. And honestly, I don't really want to get into that sort of discourse.
Oh, God.
I just like comparing their narrative themes and stuff, because I'm based and simple like that.
Oh God, almost. That was one of those things. And I saw a tweet of somebody complaining that, they really hoped that in 5 or 10 years, they didn't have people complaining or saying that Undertale was actually a bad game and was just a stepping stone for Deltarune and stuff like that. Oh. I know, Undertale is a much rougher, more simple game compared to Deltarune, but calling it a bad game? You're going too far with that one.
So let's do just that and talk about control. Undertale conveys themes of control by portraying the player as an absolute god of the narrative. We can save and reload,
Most music apps have some kind of one-size-fits-all workout playlist. But the YouTube Music app,
we can kill or spare, just like Flowey, we can do anything, as despite the idea of consequences for our actions being evident from the get-go, we are pretty much exempt from it all due to our omnipresence and our ability to literally manipulate time and space within the game's universe, often without any serious recourse whatsoever. However, Deltarune portrays themes of control on a much more personal level, showing how these themes define each of its main characters in one way or another. And today I want to talk about the character I think is the greatest victim of control in the story of Deltarune. Kris, the player character, or rather, the character the player controls as an unwilling vessel. The unfortunate human who gets stuck with a soul who has a mind of its own, and is forced to allow it to control them or fight back as much as they can. In this video, I want to delve into the relationship between Kris and their soul, seemingly opposing entities forced to cooperate with one another, and how each chapter continues to flesh out their relationship more and more.
It's funny, just before this, I watched Andrew Cunningham's newest video, and he pointed out that the thing is about, all of this with the soul, it seems like that Kris knows, and, for some reason there's a plan involving us, and Kris is kind of being forced by the plan to have us control their body, which they don't like. Which, thinking back, I love, because there's a couple of comics I've watched before, obviously before Chapter 3 and 4 came out, where there was one I saw where it talked about how, or it speculated or just had fun with the fact that it's Kris did a demon summoning ritual, And that's where we came in, where they didn't know it was going to be actually real or stuff like that. But no, it seems like Kris having us control Kris was very much a part of the plan.
Showing the souls, or rather the players, attempts to shape the world around them, and how Kris fights for their own autonomy. But first, spoiler warning for chapters 1 through 4 obviously, and also be sure to like and subscribe to support future videos, it really helps out a lot. I was originally also going to talk about control regarding other characters like Susie, Rouse, and Noelle in this video, but I realized that it was going to be too long just talking about Kris, so I might make a follow-up video for those other 3 characters later down the line. Comment below if you'd want to see that. Also,
sure,
tell me if I missed anything important because there's a lot of details that Tricky Tony put into this game.
Honestly, I've been watched several videos recently, and where did the whole thing about calling Toby Tricky Tony come from? Because, like, that can't have just come up from nowhere. Like, who started that?
Make a pinned comment listing everything you guys point out. I also have a Discord server where I post announcements for my latest video releases. Thanks a lot. In Chapter 1, back in the good old days of 2018 when the game looked like some sort of sketchy piece of malware called survey_program, players were intrigued.
I mean, you say that as if it isn't still a sketchy bit of malware.
By the starting scene, where they were asked to create a customized character using a very simple creation menu, some bizarre personality trait options, and even giving them a name. However, everything gets thrown out of the window with the line, "No one can choose who they are in this world," before it's revealed that the player would instead be controlling some human teenager named Kris. Honestly, not much happens in this chapter to imply that Kris is being unwillingly controlled. The writing does a great job of lulling the player into a false sense of security. After all, the last time Toby Fox made a game like this, we controlled Frisk, a blank self-insert who hardly had a personality beyond how we chose to express ourselves through them.
Yeah.
It would make sense for a player to automatically assume Kris is the same, just an empty vessel for the player to pilot through a quirky story. This complacency, however, leads well into the first major twist of Deltarune. At the end
Kris
of the
is
chapter,
their own
there's a
person.
cutscene where Kris autonomously shambles out of bed like a zombie, savagely tears their own soul out of their chest, and hurls it into a birdcage. They brandish a knife menacingly, concluding chapter 1 on a sinister note. In actuality, this isn't really a full-on cutscene per se. The player retains control in the scene, as in, they can
control
move the
the
soul
soul
around, just futilely within the birdcage. This is the first real indication that we as players are in fact controlling the soul, not Kris, who is their own entity, already setting up a unique dynamic between the player and their unwilling vessel.
God. It's one of those things, like, thinking back to when we only had chapter 1, and thinking back, like, all the theories about people trying to figure out, like, people trying to, like, oh, is Kris actually possessed? Is there somebody in the body that takes control away from us? Thinking back, I remember how it wasn't until chapter 2 where people really started to, like, click onto the fact that Kris was in fact their own person, and how much that kind of shook things up. Oh, God. And just to think, we'd get another big shakeup when chapter 3 and 4 showed up. Knowing that they're on the you little traitor.
With the chapter 1 reveal out of the way, chapter 2 gets to more openly explore this idea of Kris and their soul being two separate entities. While it starts off pretty tame, it turns out that the reason why Kris removed their soul and took out a knife last night was so they could just enjoy Toriel's whole butterscotch cinnamon pie for themselves, which is just silly teenage behavior compared to the other insane stuff they'll be doing later on. We get to see some more indications of how Kris can subtly influence how others perceive the choices the player makes through their own behavior. My favourite example of this is after the Spamton Neo boss battle. Susie is the only one to express confusion about the fight, and ask Kris if they are okay. The player is given the option to say yes or no. Choosing yes will have Susie and Rouse notice that Kris said it forcefully, as though through gritted teeth. And choosing no will apparently have Kris shout the words so loudly that even Susie is shocked by the outburst. Clearly, Kris is not okay with what just transpired, and honestly that's pretty fair. Being forced by your own soul to explore a dingy basement at the whims of a psychotic salesman does seem like a pretty traumatizing experience. Speaking of the Spamton Neo boss battle, the titular character only fights the party because he wants Kris's soul.
Yeah, because his whole thing is also about control as well, because he thinks that, you know, the soul will give him freedom. Oh, actually, thinking about it, I remember not that long ago, and I'll have to see if I can find it again. But I remember I actually came across a comic somebody made where they actually depicted, Spamton actually getting the soul and then coming to realize that, hey, wait, there's something, wait, what's going on? I'm being controlled by something else. Help, what's happening?
Believing that it's the key to breaking free of his puppet strings. The irony isn't lost on me that Spamton thinks he can achieve true freedom simply by obtaining the thing that holds control over Kris. Furthermore, Kris also expresses themselves more through their facial expressions, such as Susie catching on that they're angry when Kris tries to play the piano in the hospital, but obviously can't because they aren't in full control of their own body. It's interesting to think about the extent to which Kris is able to act autonomously despite the player's influence. Of course, the Snowgrave route really solidifies the differences between Kris and the player, but we'll talk about that in its own section of this video. At the end of the chapter, we see another cutscene where Kris tears their soul out of their own body once again and stuffs it into the couch before creating a dark fountain in their own home. Every chapter gradually adds more mystery as to what Kris's true motives are, and what role we as the player have in fulfilling or opposing their goals. Chapters 3 and 4 go even further to flesh out the dichotomy between Kris and player.
Again, honestly, not this one, but the one later on where, or it was earlier. I forget which a question is, but there's the question about what is Kris's favorite flavor or favorite food, and quite literally, if you take too long, Kris will cough and move the cursor down to pie themselves. I love those little things. And also, just later on, going like the weird, like hidden mini game for the Shadow Mantle. At a point, to level up and move on, you have to kill the in-game version, like the in-game version of Ralsei and Susie. And Kris looks away from the screen whenever you do that.
During Tenna's board games, the funny TV man asks a lot of trivia questions, many of which pertain to Kris's personal life. One of the questions is about what Kris's favorite food is, and chocolate is one of the potential answers. I like this because it goads long-standing Toby Fox fans into potentially picking that option, as they might accidentally misconstrue the personality of Kris with that of Kara, a similar-looking character from Undertale whose favorite food was chocolate. I'll admit that I chose chocolate on my first playthrough because I remembered dialogue from chapter 1 where Sans said that Toriel had to hide her chocolate so Kris wouldn't find it.
See, I didn't remember that. I just remembered chapter 1 where, Kris ate an entire pie themselves.
Still, Kris tries their best to push us towards the correct answer, constantly moving their cursor towards the answer, pie, which I think is a neat detail where Kris does their damnedest to control their own movements in spite of the player's stupidity. In the optional Susie Zeller physical challenge, Tenna notes that Kris and Ralsei control her like an unwanted puppet, which is just a small throwaway line that has a lot more meaning to Kris than Tenna might think. Furthermore, when playing the racing game in the green room with Susie, the player remains locked in the top-down perspective and therefore can't even see the screen, so all that can be done is blindly mashing buttons and inevitably crashing.
Which, again, the fact that that there's actually technically a race going on there is just... That is honestly brilliant. I'm gonna be being completely honest here. If I was in Toby's shoes in developing Chapter 3, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have thought of it. Oh, let's have an actual hidden race here that you can win if you're careful enough.
Causing Susie to express confusion as to why Kris is playing as though they aren't even looking at the game. A lot more about the relationship between Kris and the Soul is conveyed through the secret S-rank console minigame. While playing this minigame, it may seem as though the player is controlling the little pixel Kris simply by controlling the real Kris's inputs on their controller. However, there is another more interesting interpretation. When the game is booted up, the Soul appears first on the screen and is then overlaid by the game visuals. However, we can see that Pixel Kris loads in exactly where the Soul is positioned on the screen. I like the interpretation that the player isn't controlling Kris when we play this minigame, but instead they straight up enter a new vessel temporarily, the in-game version of Kris themselves. This is evident in the fact
I've said the exact same thing before. The fact that during that one part after you get the Shadow Mantle when Susie walks in, and you still have control over the little mini pixel Kris, and it completely ignoring regular Kris, and you can attack Susie to make Kris grab her and then kind of initiate a very cute moment between the two of them. The shippers just absolutely feasted on these 2 chapters, honestly.
That dying in the secret ERAM boss will cause a genuine game over, as though the video game enemy actually depleted Kris or the soul's HP to 0. The idea that the soul is using Pixel Kris as a vessel is also supported by the fact that Pixel Kris is able to leave the game window completely without regular Kris's input, and even attempts to attack them. Once the player gains control of Kris again, they can just enter the game itself and collect the Shadow Mantle, so that's something they can do now. Sure.
Yeah.
Part of the minigame also features a Pixel tenor who monologues about the doomed Yowie between himself and Spamton, but the important part of this is what he says at the end. He looks directly at the screen, towards the real Kris and us, the player, saying,
I did what you said, Kris. Just like our deal. You aren't going to turn me off again, are you?
Before Pixel Kris is forced to kill him to continue walking the path. This dialogue implies that Kris spoke to Tenor at some point between the end of Chapter 2 and the start of Chapter 3 without the player knowing, possibly immediately after opening the fountain. I'm assuming the deal had something to do with stalling the party with his games to buy time for the Roaring Night to arrive, in exchange for all the attention he could ever want, including a literal captive audience for him to entertain. Jumping ahead to a tidbit from Chapter 4, the Deltarune prophecy states, "The Lord of Screens cleaved red by blade," with the accompanying image of a TV being sliced in half. The implication being that Tenor is destined to die at the hands of the Knight, which he does, unless all enemies in Chapter 3 are recruited, in which case Susie defies the prophecy by miraculously repairing him. More on that in a future video, if I ever get around to making it.
Again, that's one of those things, like... Oh, I mean, that just kind of goes the whole thing, like there's the whole, like, the, not really subtext or anything, that Susie is basically good at, you know, defying what is, like, expected. It basically, you know, she's not in the prophecy. She's not, basically because, I'd imagine, because she's not in the prophecy. She doesn't have anything restricting her or saying that, oh, she is going to do this. So she's able to basically break it and, like, bring Tenna back to life, essentially.
And once again, comment below if you would like to see me tackle the themes of control in other characters. So anyway, why is this part of the prophecy important to this video, you might ask? Well, one of the most important aspects to defeating the Roaring Knight in Chapter 3 is obtaining the super secret Shadow Mantle armor. It's not essential to winning the battle, and it's definitely possible without if you're a dodging god. But the Shadow Mantle does stop your whole team from being wiped in like 3 turns, so it's pretty damn powerful. Typically during the Tenna fight, Kris does a pitiful amount of damage, less than even Rousey, clearly because they don't want to harm their depressed TV, but assumedly also because they know that for the prophecy to be fulfilled, Tenna must stay alive long enough to be killed by the Roaring Knight. However, if the...
I never noticed that he also... So, again, the whole thing with Kris pulling their punches in Chapter 3, I knew. I mean, again, like, the whole thing with the Knight, I've heard that. I never noticed that he also does the same thing with Tenna. Interesting.
Shadow Mantle has been obtained, Kris does way more damage to Tenna than Rousey or even Susie. I think this implies that Kris knows that by obtaining the Shadow Mantle, the player wants to challenge the Knight and defeat them. So Kris is trying to take matters into their own hands by killing Tenna themselves in case the Knight is not able to, due to the player's deviation from the set path. Speaking of the Knight, Kris actually does the least damage to them out of the 3 party members. Yep. On my first playthrough, I thought I was doing something seriously wrong when Kris with their best weapon was doing about 16 damage, and Rousey was doing like 30 with a scarf I got from Chapter 2. But now it makes a little more sense that Kris would be holding back against their presumed secret ally. If you manage to get to the end of the Roaring Knight fight without taking any damage, there's a unique line of dialogue which reads, "Kris coughed. The enemy slowly tilted its head." With the knowledge of Chapter 4 that Kris is in cahoots with either the Knight themselves or someone working alongside them, this scene is pretty funny because it's essentially Kris telling the Knight that they suck and that the battle's been going for too long and they need to wrap it up. There's also something intriguing about the wording of a lot of the other flavor text, such as "your vision narrows" and "your chest feels tight." A lot of it is written in second person, referring to you, the player.
Interesting. I remember in another video they were talking about the potential that, like, it was the Soph's video talking about the theory that the Knight was Rudy, and the whole thing that's like, oh, the idea that, you know, the Knight powers physically hurt you and that's why he's sick, and maybe they're like contagious or something. That's why, you know, your vision narrows and you feel tight. But the fact that potentially these are not talking about Kris, they're talking about us, the player, specifically. Interesting. That's very interesting.
Rather than Kris or any other character in the battle. Anyway, let's move on to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 focuses a lot on Susie's struggles with accepting fate and her place in life. But we don't care about that right now, we're here to talk about Kris. While in the holiday house, Susie starts distracting Noelle and prompts Kris to go search for clues to the shelter door code. Eventually, the player will take Kris to Des's room and examine the very bright and out-of-place guitar, which seemingly has an important code on it. However, before the player can fully read the code, Kris rudely interrupts the dialogue box by tearing their soul out of their body and shoving it into a box in the closet before shambling away. For maybe the first time ever, the soul is now free to travel through the light world without their vessel, though they are limited to traversing the vents for the most part. Upon making it to the kitchen, Kris can be seen drinking some chocolate milk while on a phone call with a mysterious person. After the call ends, Kris shambles off-screen and presumably begins to play the Holiday's piano. It's simultaneously sweet and tragic that one of the first things that Kris does once free of their controller is play the piano. They've finally regained their autonomy for a brief period, so they're making the most of their time by doing something they love. Furthermore, later, while the player is engaging in a Tom and Jerry skit with Kris in Des's closet, Noelle mentions that she's thought that Kris has been sounding different for the past few days, though Susie doesn't understand what she means. The implication being that Kris's current quote-unquote voice is actually the player's, and somehow Noelle is the only one to notice. Not even Kris's own mother can tell the difference, which I think is interesting. In Ross's room in his...
I mean, for that, I'd always pictured it not as so much the sound of the voice as just Kris's inflection. Because it's been kind of pointed out that when we choose like a dialogue option for Kris to say, Kris literally says that dialogue option. They don't they don't embellish it or say it naturally. If the option is yes or no, they'll literally just say yes or no, like in a very robotic sort of tone. Literally, like in the church at the beginning of chapter 4, when you ask like, I forget, is it Noelle? About like keys? Like it's inferred that Kris literally just said keys. And then Noelle's kind of confused and kind of goes off on like thinking that Kris was saying that she was singing off key in the choir. So, like, it's like, we have control over Kris. It's not very acute control, though. Like, it's very much like, honestly, I think we would have just as easy a time as controlling Kris if we had, like, a single, like, Atari joystick with a single button. Like, that's all we really have. Like, the fact that we technically control Kris with a keyboard literally does not matter in the slightest. Man, I actually think I need to dust underneath this thing, wow.
Castle, he opens up to Kris about how he's starting to gain a sense of self-worth, and asks if it's normal for a Darkner to feel this way. The player is then given the options to say, please be yourself, or, of course not. Saying please be yourself is obviously the nicer and more correct choice, but if the player chooses the meaner one, Rouse still reacts positively, implying that Kris simply said, of course, and omitted the last word.
Exactly.
I like that this shows that even without player input, Kris truly cherishes Rouse and the other Darkness. In the Church Dark World, the prophecy denotes Kris as the first hero, the cage, with human soul and parts, which, you know, makes a lot of sense given the context of the situation. Furthermore, with the encouragement of their friends, Kris seems even more capable of acting out of the player's control. This occurs in the big piano puzzle, where Kris closes their eyes and autonomously plays the entire piece by themselves. Just a funny tidbit about this piano puzzle, the player is never able to play the music correctly on the first try, and even if they make a real attempt to play the piece manually on the piano, they will always get the last note wrong, implying that Kris is intentionally stopping the player from completing the puzzle. Hence, Kris will always get to fully play the music themselves, expressing one of the few joys they still have. This wrong note that they play is its own track in the OST called Concert for You. It's literally just a 2-second clip of the discordant plink that Kris plays when forced to play the piano by the player. I think the track's name is pretty apt because it captures perfectly how Kris feels towards their soul.
Okay, again, I mean, I bought the soundtrack for Deltarune once it fully released. I haven't finished going all the way through, but the fact that there's a song that's literally just a single note. Ah, God. Kris.
Kris's performance, their concert for us, the player, consists of a single off-key note because that's what they think we deserve. The biggest thing we get to see in this chapter is something that's pretty heavily hinted at from previous installments. Throughout each chapter, often when Susie runs off on her own side quest, Ralse asks Kris to close their eyes and imagine something, usually what Susie is doing. And each time the player chooses to do so, their perspective does in fact shift to a different scene. However, each time we fade back to Kris, Ralse is either absent or in the middle of explaining something to Kris, which is strange. The fact that when the player refuses to close their eyes, Ralse gets shocked and confused is also suspicious. This has led to the interpretation that when Kris closes their eyes in the Dark World, they essentially eject us, the soul, from their body for a brief period of time, allowing us to see things from another perspective and allowing Kris to be themselves for a bit.
But again, and then they play with that in Chapter 4, when you do that again, and when you open your eyes, Ralse's just gone. Honestly, I'm honestly thinking about it, I highly anticipate that in a future chapter, maybe Chapter 5, maybe later on, but eventually we'll have one of those where, you know, we close our eyes and Kris is just in a completely different place. Now, we had something like this in Chapter 4 where you're watching Susie in the dark and trying to guide her, and then while she's fighting the Gerson statue, Kris shows up. But I'm talking about where, like in a future chapter, you go to watch Susie or whoever you want to choose, and then when you go back to Kris, they're just in a completely different place and doing something completely different.
This would also obviously imply that Ralse is aware that Kris is being controlled by another entity. In Chapter 4, this is enforced by scenes where Kris gets to close their eyes and is able to do things out of the player's control. For example, when the old man, tells Kris to close their eyes so they can drink their tea, which they do happily without our input. The whole Kris closing their eyes to project the soul elsewhere thing comes to a very dramatic head in Chapter 4, when Susie is chasing down the old man in her sanctuary dark world. Kris, and by extension the player, lose track of Susie in a dark maze room, and Kris, with no hope of finding their friend, does the only thing they know to do out of sheer desperation. They close their eyes and imagine where Susie is, and well, it actually works. The player's perspective does shift over to where Susie is as she finally encounters the old man she's been chasing. I like the interpretation that this perspective shift and the player's control during the ensuing battle is what helps Kris to locate where Susie is and save her from a killing blow. Unfortunately, while the developing relationship between Kris and their soul is sweet and all, we gotta talk about the spooky scary part of the game.
Yeah, here we go.
What's up? You got something against Noelle, Kris?
Things took a weird route, eh?
Like, hey, maybe things took a weird... Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god.
Again, the fact Toby did that, like, how many more times do you think we might see that in the game? Do you think we will? Or do you think that was just a one-off thing? Because again, Chapter 4 did have a lot of weird moments like that, like with the, oh, that's a weird, things took a weird route, and hey, Among Us reference.
Of course, we can't talk about player control in Deltarune without talking about the weird route and its impact on one specific character. I'll talk more about that one specific character in a follow-up video, but this video is mainly focusing on the relationship between the player and Kris, so we'll just discuss certain parts of this route. Throughout this twisted version of the narrative, the player is required to kill as many darkness as possible, using Noelle's Ice Shock spell. Furthermore, the player must also make specific dialogue choices to say to Noelle, many of which have a possessive nature, and stripping Noelle of her independence and agency, such as saying, "I will ride with you," when Noelle asks who she should ride with on a Ferris wheel. In many situations, the player must also tell Noelle to proceed, and she begins to believe that in order to escape this bizarre dream she's trapped in, she must become stronger, and the only way she can become stronger is by listening to the voice speaking instructions to her. This culminates in the player purchasing the Thorn Ring from Spamton, and equipping it to Noelle, then commanding her to use the special Snowgrave spell on Birdley, outright killing him in the Dark World and resulting in his comatose state in the Light World. One might assume that throughout the weird route, the player is simply controlling Kris and telling them what to say and do to Noelle, but that couldn't be further from the truth. In Hometown, after returning from the cyber world, Kris and Susie can visit Rudy and Noelle in the hospital, where Noelle leaves very suddenly upon seeing Kris. The player then experiences a creepy cutscene where Noelle talks to herself about how the strange voice that drove her down that murderous path wasn't Kris's. Rather, it was some otherworldly, disembodied being that she simply felt compelled to obey. This is interesting, as this is the first time in the game that anyone notes that the player's voice sounds different to Kris's. Since Chapter 3 takes place completely in a dark world, Noelle isn't present, so there isn't really much weird route content. There were only 2 changes that occur if the player is on the weird route, and only one of them is important to this video. It comes in some slightly modified dialogue by Eram, the Shadow Mantle boss, where it taunts Kris, or possibly the player, for enjoying the act of collecting shadow crystals. In the weird route, 2 extra lines of dialogue are added, where it much more directly addresses the player controlling Kris. It mentions the events of Chapter 2's weird route and acknowledges the fact that the player doesn't feel the need to take responsibility for what happened, since they performed their actions through a proxy, Kris. It's very thematically fitting and adds to the mystique of this character. Who the hell is this Halloween decoration thing, and how does it know about the existence of Kris and the Soul as separate entities?
God, again, there is just so much weird stuff involving like Chapter 3, because I mean, again, it's been said how many times, but, you know, Toby specifically pointed out that Chapter 3 was more gimmicky. And so, like, obviously a lot of things are different, you know, the secret boss isn't the same, like, how, like, the whole S-route thing is like, confusing. And I'm like, honestly, what are you? What is your deal? Because just... I forget, what was the name of what were the names that people were, like, using from, like, the files or something? I know they found, like, the sprite name or something like that, but I can't remember it off the top of my head.
In Chapter 4, there are a lot more deviations from the main plotline due to the extensive amount of time spent in Hometown. The pertinent part occurs after Noelle invites Kris and Susie to her house, and Kris stuffs the soul into a box. Instead of a comedic set piece where Susie and Noelle bond awkwardly while Kris jams out on a grand piano, the vibes are much more akin to a thriller or horror film. Noelle invites Kris to her room where the two of them discuss an incident that happened the previous night. After the end of Chapter 3, Kris presumably removed their soul and went to Noelle's home, where they apologized for the events of Chapter 2 and reassured Noelle that everything would be okay. Kris also removes a thorn embedded in Noelle's finger, presumably the light world representation of the thorn ring. Noelle then asks if she can say something else, which results in something bizarre occurring. The soul gets transported out of the vents and into the dialogue box, once again breaking the fourth wall in a very clever way. After choosing to proceed, the player is able to move the soul around the room and enter Kris's body again.
Which I really have to wonder, like, what was going on through Kris's mind when that happened? Like, I can imagine just the outright terror they might have felt when they felt, like, the stirrings of the soul's control over them again. Or, like, the fact that it was somehow able to just teleport, you know, from the vents into the room due to a dialogue box. Like, honestly, that's one of those things. It's one of those scenes that I'd love to see a comic of, just to see from Kris's perspective, like, how somebody interprets it.
Once again, the player gets to absolutely torment Noelle by speaking directly to her through their omnipotent voice, reading her every thought and eventually forcing Kris to equip the thorn ring to her again and completely breaking her mentally. After this, Kris goes to the bathroom, throws the soul into a trash can, and just kicks the hell out of us. The fading visuals and the blurred vision exemplify the pure hatred and rage Kris is definitely feeling right now. We, as the soul, are psychologically torturing their neighbor and childhood friend, and are making Kris themselves complicit in the vile act. After this, Kris puts their soul back in themselves and leaves, now at half HP. Later, Susie asks Kris what they were speaking to Noelle about, and very abruptly, the music cuts out, the background gets tinted red, and the player is given a dialogue choice, only there aren't any words in the dialogue box. While this part is a little silly from a tonal perspective and feels a lot like a try-hard creepypasta moment, I still like how it fits thematically. The music cut and the red tint can be read as Kris's anger blocking out everything else when thinking about what happened to Noelle, and there are 2 possible interpretations for the lack of dialogue choices. 1. Kris is refusing to give the soul any options to choose from, as they don't want the player to tell Susie about what they've been putting Noelle through, or 2, the soul is refusing to make any mention of what they're doing, as they want to keep their treatment of Noelle a secret from Susie.
Yeah.
It's a terrifying concept. Imagine having to live your life knowing that almost every step you took, almost every word you said, was controlled by some alien entity inside your own body. Imagine trying to keep a secret from that entity, how you can't tell anyone about your predicament because you fear they won't believe you, or you fear that the entity will find out about your insolence.
And again, like, I talked about it before, about my wants before chapters 3 and 4 came out, but like what I wanted or hoped would happen, and the whole thing about, you know, potentially being able to befriend Kris before we fully understood how involved they were with the Knight. Honestly, it is... The more you think of it, the more just eldritch and terrifying Kris's situation really is. And what do you know? We're the eldritch abomination in this situation.
Imagine the dread that comes with knowing that while you can temporarily free yourself from the entity and experience true freedom for a moment, eventually you'll not only be forced to reunite with it, but you'll also be the one to put them back inside you, making that brief glimpse of freedom feel even more tantalizing. Imagine being able to fight the entity. In fact, you can really physically hurt it, but it doesn't matter because however much damage you do to it, at the end of the day, you can't destroy it because you need it and it needs you. It's a symbiotic relationship that borders on parasitic. Kris needs the soul to enter dark worlds and to close fountains, but in exchange, they must surrender their own body and agency as a vessel for us, the soul, to do whatever we want. Jeez, this is a miserable line of discussion. Let's move on.
Please?
While most people consider Undertale to be Toby Fox's supreme fourth wall breaking commentary on choice in video games, and Deltarune to be a more traditional fantasy tale, I still enjoy a lot of the more meta elements in the latter. It shows that Toby Fox still isn't afraid to continue toying with the medium of video games and creating stories that revolve around player choice and perspective.
Honestly, thinking about it, I'd honestly say they're both, I mean, at least so far, they're both very much, you know, commentary on fourth wall and, like, player, like, interaction with the games and stuff like that. The only thing is, Undertale is very in-your-face about it. I mean, again, they talk about saving and loading in-universe and stuff like that. While everything that, you know, involves, like, breaking the fourth wall and stuff like that in Deltarune is very much, like, subtext. And it's not in-your-face. It's only stuff that, like, we, the players, would notice. It's not an in-universe thing, so to speak. Like, there's, like, saving and loading is something Kris can do, but it's not actively talked about or an active, like, known thing in-universe by other people. Even if, in Undertale, the only other person that knew about it was Flowey.
As well as the relationships between the player and the characters they interact with. The themes of control ring very powerfully through Deltarune in many ways, but especially in Kris. Having the player character be an unwilling vessel with their own opinions, personality, and sense of agency is such an interesting concept that I don't think I've done it justice with just this video. There's a lot to chew on, the notion of controlling another person. Is it right for us to do this? Probably not, but how bad is it? Probably pretty bad, but who knows.
Very, yeah.
And yet, despite all of this, Kris still has some autonomy, and I like that. Even when the soul is within them, they can talk independently, emote without our input, and even be a silly little goblin at times. Even though as a player I'm still complacent in controlling Kris when I play Deltarune, I'm just genuinely happy that there are moments when they can truly be themselves. One must imagine Kris Dreamer happy, and I'm seriously interested in how the story will continue to develop this nuanced relationship from chapters 5 onwards. Will Kris and their soul get closer and come to some sort of mutual understanding? Or will they remain at odds with each other to the very end? Or maybe it'll be something in between? Only time will tell. Anyway, this video has been going long enough and I need to end it at some point. Thanks for watching. As usual, please feel free to like and subscribe and maybe join the Discord server. And also comment your thoughts below and anything I might have missed. Additionally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that potential follow-up video. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next video.
Like, it really sucks, because again, the whole thing is that, it really sucks, because again, the whole thing that, you know, Kris being their own person, and we're controlling them against their will, that is honestly, like, horrifying to think about. But at the same time, given just how everything in the game is working, and the fact that, you know, we have, like, an imperfect control over them, and, like, and the fact that we can't actually talk with them ourselves to either figure out what they're doing or what they're feeling or, you know, stuff like that. It honestly is, like, just that we control Kris, but there is such a level of disconnect between us and them that it honestly, like, granted, I know it's there for a reason, but at the same time, it annoys me and infuriates me at the same time. But yeah, that's definitely going to be it for now. So yeah, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.